when we do supply response assessments, we classically use rubrics. So in the US, there are two assessment consortia that have built assessment frameworks that go with the Common Core standards. And this here is an example of the Common Core standards assessment rubric produced by one of the two big assessment consortia in the US, the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, for explanation text in grade 6. And what you can see, you have a number of different levels here. A 0 is if you've done nothing which is measurable, essentially. That's really what it is. And then 1, 2, 3, and 4 describe the 4 levels. There are only 4 levels. We're only going to divide our student groups up into these 4 categories, and they're kind of comparative assessments. So if you're a human assessor assessing a text, you make a judgment call about which of these levels is about approximately the level at which a particular text is operating. Now, it's approximate, it's vague, but one of the problems with this in a standardized assessment regime or a mass, bureaucratic assessment regime is this comes at the end. What happens is at the end of the year, we're going to judge the teachers and we're going to judge the kids and we're going to give them these tests. And this is the rubric we're going to use. And by the way, there are attempts also to take texts which have been graded using natural language processing technologies and put them against these 4 levels as well. So this is the way in which these technologies work. They don't finely differentiate students. They just put them into big categories like this, which only very roughly, statistically correlate with these kinds of measurements. I mean, the machine can't actually measure the intellectual points that are made at each level. The machine can't measure that. It can only find correlations with human judgments at each of these levels. So anyhow, this is a classic piece of rubric-based assessment for supply assessment in the case of writing. One of the classic problems with these kinds of assessment is that they come at the end and they're not much useful. They're not much use to learning. So one of the things we've tried to do with our research and development work and developing the Scholar platform is we've been trying to reframe these rubrics. And what we have here is exactly the same text type at exactly the same educational level, addressing exactly the same standards. However, we want to do that as formative assessment. So what we want to do is we want the student to be able to see the rubric. It's not just that they're judged at the end in order to give them a 1 to 4 score. We want them to know explicitly what this rubric is. We want them to use that rubric while they're writing. We want to actually get them to give feedback to others against this rubric. But what that means is that we have to reframe the rubric. So we're talking about the same language features, but we reframe it from a kind of retrospective and judgmental perspective, which is what we see in the Smarter Balanced summative assessments, to what we call prospective and constructive, thinking forward constructively. And because we're giving these to peers, we give peers suggestions about how they might help their peers improve their others. So what we've tried to do is take exactly the same standard and move it from a summative point of assessment to a formative point of assessment. And that way, hopefully, allow this standard and this assessment to play a much more constructive role in the student's learning. Here we are with a Scholar screen that we showed a few videos back in this series. So on the left, we've got the student producing their work. On the right, while they produce the work, they see the rubric, which is taken, in this case, from the Common Core standards. What happens is we change a linear process into a recursive cyclical process. So the linear process of summative assessment is do your work, study, do the test one way, and here's the answer, B+, level 4, whatever it happens to be. Okay, so it's a linear process and there's nothing recursive or cyclical from a pedagogical point of view in that. But what we do is we build in our assessment process, which has this very, very powerful emphasis on formative assessment. So remember I said before, we've been obsessed by summative assessment, we're driven by that. Okay, let's move the assessment business to the formative phase. So as I plan my work, I see the rubric, which gives me a picture of explicit picture of what's expected in a text which meets the criterion, which meets the standard. Then as I start drafting the text, again, I've got that assessment rubric beside me and I keep referring to it. Then what I do is I get other people's work to review. So in other words, I put my work in and then I get other people's, and I see the same rubric and they've written about something different, they've written about it a different way, and it tells me something. Again, it tells me something about the rubric, and then I am also expected to give constructive feedback against that rubric. So when in the next phase I get my work back, not only do I get comments and thoughts and feedback, some of which I might not have had, from the other students against that rubric, not only do I do that, but I've had this experience of giving feedback to others and seeing their work. So it's a very recursive kind of process. Again, assessment is central, formative assessment is central, but I'm going back over again the assessment rubric, and I'm going back over a student-oriented version of the standards. The standards are classically written for teachers and for educational bureaucrats and administrators, those kinds of people. So what we've tried to do is translate those standards explicitly into forms of text which are intelligible to students. And by the way, you know, one of the things about explicit versus implicit learning, you might recall when we were talking about authentic pedagogy, it's about immersion. Well, one of the classic arguments against that, if you're not from a background where there are lots of books at home and parents are educated, if you're from a disadvantaged background, classically, you really need the rules of the game spelled out explicitly. It's better for you to say, look, this is what's expected explicitly, and that's what we can do in an assessment rubric. Okay, so I'm going to now revise my work using the feedback that I've got, using the experience of seeing other people's work, and then just before it goes to publication, I might be asked to write a self-review. So let's think reflectively about the way in which I took on board or didn't take on board the other peers' feedback. Perhaps the teacher gave me feedback as well against this rubric along the way in a formative kind of way. And I might write a summative, or it is in a way a kind of a summative or a concluding self-reflection before that work gets published to my e-portfolio. So what we've got here is a kind of a play backwards and forwards between the writing work I'm doing, the literacy work I'm doing, and the rubric, the assessment rubric, backwards and forwards in the scholar scheme of things, the two sides of the screen, backwards and forwards. So I write my work, I look at the rubric, I get it back, and I write a review. I get other students, 2 or 3 other students' work to review, and I write a review. I get my work back, I look at the reviews, I revise my work, I write a self-review. So backwards and forwards, it's a very recursive process where incrementally, criterion by criterion, and particularly if we describe those criteria out very, very clearly, I'm getting closer to the standard. I'm getting a chance to get closer and closer to the standard. Now, one of the very interesting things that we've discovered in this research is that this actually produces outcomes which are more similar to each other than an outcome where there's just one assessment at the end. Just one assessment at the end really destines the results to come out like a normal distribution curve because you don't give a chance for other students to catch up with each other. So just seeing each other's work, where better students give the poorer students feedback, where you see models anonymously in an anonymous peer review situation, where you get feedback after feedback after feedback against the criterion, means you get multiple chances to get close to the criterion. So one of our kind of theoretical and philosophical commitments here is criterion referenced assessment, where via this incremental process, every student in the class can get closer to the criterion. Now, that's not a matter of bringing the best students down to the standard of the mediocre, the middle of the class. It's a matter of bringing all the class up to the standard of the best students, which standard is clearly specified in the rubric to which all students have access and to which they are exposed multiple times.